This episode of Art Block is brought to you by the supporters of my Patreon. If you would like to support the show, the link to my Patreon page and my merch site are in the description below. Hello and welcome to Art Block, the show where we talk about art and how it's made. I'm your host Spirit, and today I'll be talking about how to draw humans. Or in this case, how I draw humans and some tips and tricks regarding the process. So without further ado, here's a general tutorial on how I draw humans. So first things first, before we talk about details such as hands, feet, faces, etc., we're going to talk about the general construction of the figure. Now each person has a slightly different body and skeletal shape, but for the moment we're going to use the head as the general point of reference. On average, the adult human body is about 7 to 8 heads tall, so keep this in mind when you're constructing the rest of the body so they don't appear too short or too tall. When starting off, you're going to want to draw very lightly on your paper with your pencil, starting off with a basic circle and then sketching out a sort of half octagon to represent where the jaw is. Next, I draw a quick line to represent the neck before proceeding to create a curved sort of S shape to represent the spine. Before starting on the rib cage, I make a quick arcing motion to show the general direction of where the shoulders are going to go, and after setting up 2 circles to represent the rough spot of where the shoulders are going to be, I will begin adding the rib cage. Now if you're less experienced with drawing people, I would suggest maybe adding the rib cage before drawing the shoulders. I've become practiced enough to where I'm familiar with the rough distance, but that is something that will come with time. When roughing out the rib cage, I generally start off with a basic oval and then create a sort of concave shape to show where it curves up. Now at this point, you do have to understand whether you're drawing a male or a female. In this case, I'm going to be drawing a female body, given that they're ironically a little easier to proportion. So with that, I'm going to make the hips slightly wider than the rib cage. When it comes to doing the legs, I usually start off with a quick line to represent the upper half of the leg before making a small circle to represent the knee. Everyone's going to have legs proportioned a little differently, but as a rule of thumb, I found that the upper segment of the leg is going to be just a tiny bit shorter than the lower segment by comparison. After I've drawn the lines for the legs, I will create little triangle shapes to help represent where the feet will go. Next, we move up to the arms. When proportioning the arms, keep in mind that the hands will usually stop around the hips just below the butt. Arms are sort of 50-50, with the forearms being a little longer than the upper portion of the arm. Now that we've gotten the basic skeleton down, you can start fleshing out the rest of the figure with details, imagining where muscles and fat will go in your character. While we're here, I do want to talk about how to draw breasts, since breasts are a rather difficult aspect of drawing the human figure. Most people's mentalities simply attach 2 spheres to the front of the chest, but that's not really how breasts work physically. They kind of droop and fold over themselves, for lack of a better term, so in order to draw this, the way that I do it is to find 2 anchor points near the base of the neck and create a sort of teardrop triangle shape. If you're really stuck on how to shape the breast and then give it a bit of dimension, I personally use construction lines to create a sort of crosshair where the nipple would rest. Notice that I'm not putting it directly on the front, but rather slightly lower. This is important to understand, especially with larger breasts because, as I said, they don't rest the way that some people might think. Next, I want to express a detail regarding male anatomy, and that is the hips. Something a lot of people don't often notice when drawing males is that they have a much less pronounced pelvis, and often will draw them oddly and make them look somewhat androgynous. The way that I have come to understand male hips is that males would have 3 sort of ridges that all tie into the pelvis. There's a lot of other tutorials that would probably be able to word it better, but in order to make your character less androgynous in appearance, the 2 things you're going to focus on are the more rigid hips and the shape of the crotch. A lot of people will usually draw the same sort of V shape often seen in female characters, but in all honesty it's much more of a U shape for males. In general, nuances like these just take a lot of time, practice, and study to get right, and especially if you're 18 or in high school with parental permission, perhaps looking into attending figure drawing sessions or purchasing a figure drawing book to study from. Moving on, let's talk about drawing faces. Faces are especially hard because there are so many details and muscles to keep track of that such a slight change can end up causing the entire character to look off-model and uncanny, especially if you're going for a more realistic interpretation. As such, I can only show my method, and hopefully this will provide you guys at least a general direction on how to improve. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to use my character Casey since I don't draw him enough and he deserves a proper illustration. When drawing the human face, I generally start off with an elongated oval and draw a crosshair construction line. This will give us the basic structure for the rest of the face and a general direction of where to go. Next, I create a sort of upside down trapezoid further up on the oval. This will be the anchor point for the nose as well as a reference for the eyebrows. After that, I will start constructing the nose, which primarily starts off as a box for the middle section and following up with the nostrils and nostril ridges. Something I like to do to define the nose a little bit is to create a little line to show the nose bridge a little more, though be sure to not go too overboard as it can look a bit weird if you do it too much. After the nose, I will start defining the eyebrows. Casey as a character has not necessarily overly thick eyebrows, but very solid and sort of squared eyebrows, for lack of a better term. He's also rather confident in situations he's comfortable in, so I usually like to draw him with a sort of raised eyebrow. At this point, I start defining the actual facial structure, usually starting with the brow ridges leading to the forehead and the cheeks. Then I complete the facial shape with the jaw. After this, I will start with the eyes. When it comes to doing the eyes, I tend to lean more towards the cartoony and/or Disney style. Usually I will start off with drawing the top eyelid, following down to the rest of the eye and the tear duct. Everyone's eyes have a slightly different shape, so I would suggest if you aren't particularly practiced with drawing human-like eyes to maybe consider doing studies. Another thing to note is that when I draw eyes at the 3/4 angle, I tend to think of them in a more pseudo-dimensional sense. So instead of just flipping the other eye around, I will draw it with the eyelid and lashes going in the same direction. The next part is the hardest part of the face, and that is the mouth. The reason why I've found mouths so hard to draw is because of the lips, and especially when drawing males, it can be really hard to get a happy medium, so to speak. The way I do it is I will usually start with an M shape to define the shape of the lip. Then I will create a small ridge to further show the dimension. Another thing I would recommend doing when drawing the lip is to create this little U shape which connects the bottom of the nose to the top of the lip. After you've gotten the facial features down, it's time to work on the ears. A general rule of thumb when drawing the ears is that they will have the top part connected to around the same height as the corner of the eye, and the bottom part will connect to around the corner of the mouth. Ears have a bit of an odd complexity to them when it comes to the ridges, but when you look at it, you need to consider the shape of the ear is made to swirl inwards towards the eardrum. You can see this if you cup your hands around your ears, since it directs more reflective sound into your eardrum. Finally, we have the hair and neck. Necks tend to have different widths and lengths depending on the person's build, but in my case I usually make the neck at least 75% as wide as the head. A big pet peeve of mine is that a lot of people will make their necks super skinny, which creates this sort of bobblehead effect. So when you're drawing the neck, just try to keep in mind that it has to support the entirety of the head. When it comes to the hair, Casey's hair is very messy and tends to be rather unkempt. When drawing the hair, you need to remember that the forehead takes up at least 1/3 of the height of the head. So even if your character has bangs like he does, remember that the roots of the hair are going to be at the top of the forehead rather than in the middle. One design aspect I particularly like to use is using the hair to frame the face. My other characters have this too to some extent, but a big example of another character using this engineering is Link from Legend of Zelda. And that is the general rundown of how I draw people. Before I wrap this video up, I want to give some tips when it comes to improving your drawing and understanding how to draw people. The first and foremost is to do studies, especially with muscles and skeletal structures. Understanding what is underneath everything can really help you improve your drawing skills, especially studying the skull since it makes you think really hard and try to comprehend how structures in the face work. Really think about how everything connects and where the muscles and tendons go. Another thing I would recommend to do is that if you can, do figure studies with varying time limits. This is an exercise that people will do in art school since it challenges you to look for specific details and reach a certain level of completion over complete accuracy. One website I would recommend for this is a website called Line of Action, which features a timer that has both nude and clothed models. They also have specific studies like hands, feet, which are also important when it comes to going into fields like animation. So learning and understanding those are pretty important as well. I will be covering how to draw hands and feet in the future, but something I would really like to recommend when you are stuck is to look at your hands when you are drawing. It seems really simple, but just being able to make any pose that you need to with your hand can be incredibly useful for trying to get a pose that is just right. So do you guys have any suggestions on how to draw people? Anything you learned from this video that you thought was helpful? Tell me about it in the comments below. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. And that's about it for today's show. If you liked what you saw and you want to see more, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. It supports me and is practically free. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter and DeviantArt where I post artwork and updates about the show. I'm also happy to announce that I am officially selling merchandise on Redbubble. Get classics such as It's Just My Art Style, Bandcamp Warrior, and the one and only Mug. Everything goes to supporting me on the channel, and you get something awesome in return. All links are in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching, I'm Spirit, and I'll see you next time.